In any international armed conflict, there are more states and other parties affected by that armed conflict than just the belligerents, that is, the parties fighting the war. These other states also have duties, responsibilities, and authorities. These are described in the companion to the body of the Law of War, known as the Law of Neutrality. Welcome to another episode of The Ancient Art of Modern Warfare. I'm Chris Mayer, retired U.S. Cavalry Colonel, former instructor at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College, and prior faculty at the U.S. Army and U.S. Naval War Colleges. This series of podcasts introduces enduring lessons of war, not so much for those who study war as a profession, but for anyone who wants to fulfill their role as informed citizens in our country's deliberations about war and peace. The terms Law of War, Laws and Customs of War, Law of Armed Conflict, and International Humanitarian Law are frequently used synonymously to one another. Now, International Humanitarian Law includes the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which intends to protect the victims of armed conflict, and its additional protocols, primarily those of 1977, which intended to capture provisions of the Hague Conventions limiting or prohibiting specific means and methods of warfare. Now, this term, commonly called by its initials of IHL, does not, however, encompass all of the laws and customs of war which govern the actions of states and their military forces during international armed conflict. Among these gaps are the treaties and conventions that make up the Law of Neutrality. In any international armed conflict, states which border the territories of the warring parties and most other nations will try to continue peaceful commerce while avoiding direct involvement in that armed conflict. In some cases, this commerce passes near or even through international airspace or waters where combat action is or is likely to take place. Now, think of the current problems or recent problems, depending upon when you listen to this, regarding the Straits of Hormuz. Several conventions, declarations, and customary practices address the legal relationship between the warring parties and neutral states or other parties. Collectively, these are called the Law of Neutrality. One of the purposes of the Law of Neutrality is to limit the scope and violence of an ongoing armed conflict. If neutral commerce is protected, then there is less cause for other states to become involved in the war. Similarly, the Law of Neutrality restricts the violence directed against or by parties not participating in the armed conflict, limiting casus belli, or pressures for other countries to enter that war. What follows is a brief description of the Law of Neutrality. Now, in listening to this description, remember the source. I am not an international law specialist, just a retired cavalry officer for whom the laws and customs of war were the rules I had to follow in planning and executing combat and post-combat operations. Also, many particulars of the Law of Neutrality are either unsettled or still being debated. In all of this, keep in mind that the Law of Neutrality supplements and does not replace peacetime international law. In that way, it differs somewhat from the Law of War. So, what should you know about the Law of Neutrality? To begin, the Law of Neutrality binds both neutral states and the warring parties. The most fundamental rule is that the land, waters, and airspace of neutral states may not be violated by any of the warring parties. This means no taking shortcuts through a neutral nation's airspace, territorial waters, or marching through a bit of that nation's territory on the way to some jumping-off point for an attack or to reinforce a defense. Nor may a neutral nation allow one of the warring parties to do that. This wasn't always the case. In prior centuries, this transit was allowed without compromising the neutral status. There have also been instances of this in the past 100 years, although technically forbidden. Examples in World War II include, but are not limited to, Sweden, which allowed German traffic between Norway and Finland. 2 years before it declared war on Germany, Liberia allowed the United States to build and use an airfield to transport war material from the Western Hemisphere to British Egypt and to conduct anti-submarine warfare patrols. Switzerland famously defended its neutral status against military overflights by both the Axis and Allies, while impartially trading with both sides. In the current context, countries such as Spain, which wish to remain neutral in the conflict between the United States and Iran, are entirely within the Law of Neutrality in prohibiting U.S. military forces from operating from or overflying their airspace. On the other hand, inability to prevent such crossing or inaction in response to such crossing as is the case, for example, with Iraq and Syria, does not result in a loss of neutrality for that state. But more on that near the end of this episode. Also, the law of neutrality allows the sick and wounded of the warring parties to be evacuated through its territory, airspace, or waters without compromising its neutrality. If a neutral party is attacked by one of the warring parties, such as the missile and drone attacks by Iran against other states and territories as far away as Cyprus and the British possessions in the Indian Ocean, then these neutral states can, of course, defend themselves without losing their neutral status. As a further step, neutral states may use military ships and aircraft to escort or otherwise protect their own ships and aircraft from being intercepted or fired upon by one of the warring parties. Use of force in self-defense of these convoys of ships or aircraft is not a hostile act. Therefore, for example, the use of French warships to protect French-flagged ships passing through the Straits of Hormuz is still proper to being neutral, even if this means firing on Iranian ships or aircraft which attempt to interfere. There is even one step beyond that. One of the warring parties may come to the defense of neutral states, their ships, and aircraft that are being attacked by the opposing party when that neutral state is unable to effectively defend itself or its vessels. This means that the United States could legitimately protect neutral shipping through the Straits, the Persian Gulf, or the Arabian Sea, again without compromising the neutral status of those ships. Now, this also applies to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and shipping through the Black Sea. Additionally, if one of the warring parties attacks the other from within the territory of a neutral state, that other party may in turn attack those military capabilities, even though they are located in that neutral state. This could apply, for example, to Houthi or Hezbollah attacks from neutral states, as they are Iranian proxies supported and directed by Tehran. Of course, there are also restrictions on the neutral states themselves, but note that these are only restrictions on state activity, not on individuals or other private entities within that state. These restrictions include: neutral states must abstain from any participation in the conflict and must be impartial in their conduct with the warring parties. Neutral states, that means their governments, must not provide war-related goods and services to belligerents. This includes money and loans. However, there is no positive requirement to prevent the private commerce of war-related material to one or another of the warring parties. Think of the Swiss firm IWM making pilot watches for both the Royal Air Force and the German Luftwaffe in World War II. The neutral state must prevent its territory from being used to support any of the warring parties. This includes recruitment for both the regular armed forces of a warring party or volunteer corps or other non-state armed groups. For example, in both world wars, the British and the French could not recruit volunteers within the United States before the United States entered the war. However, they could provide information for interested Americans to travel as tourists to Canada or France in the First World War and to enlist there. The fact that the United States did not prohibit persons from doing that was also not a violation of the law of neutrality. Of course, once those persons actually enlisted in the French or British armed forces, they lost their status as neutral persons. However, the law of neutrality states that if the person were captured by the opposing force, the former neutral shall not be more severely treated by the opposing party than a citizen soldier of the state for which he is fighting. This is also reflected in Hague Convention 4, called the Law of War on Land, and the Second Geneva Convention of 1949. This same consideration applies today to foreign citizens volunteering to fight for Ukraine. Now, there are two exceptions to this complete neutrality. One is universally accepted, the other is controversial. The universally accepted exception is for the delivery of humanitarian aid. This may be delivered without compromising neutrality as long as there is reasonable assurance that this aid is intended for non-combatants and will not be diverted to military purposes. If this aid passes through international waters or airspace, one of the belligerent parties can intercept the shipment and inspect it to be sure that the shipment contains no war materiel. However, these shipments are protected from interception and inspection if they are under military escort by the state which is sending the humanitarian aid. This could be particularly important, for example, for neutral state humanitarian aid to Ukraine. The second exception is more controversial because it seems to go against the clear letter of the conventions that make up the Law of Neutrality. This is the concept that neutral states may support states that are victims of flagrant aggression, such as the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, without compromising their neutral status, so long as such support does not directly involve that state in combat. The concept of self-defense still applies, so a neutral ship could defend itself or be defended by escorting vessels without violating neutrality. Now, examples here include the shipment of U.S. war material protected by U.S. warships to Britain in the First and Second World Wars before U.S. entry into those conflicts. The German attacks on this allegedly neutral shipping was even cited as a cause for U.S. entry into World War I. Conversely, a presumed neutral state which actively supports the aggressor would violate the law of neutrality. Now, this exception to impartiality is not settled customary law, but it has been the practice since the beginning of the Second World War and is used for sending military support to Ukraine today. There are two very important qualifiers to the modern application of the law of neutrality. The first is that, unlike the Geneva Conventions of 1949, the law of neutrality only applies among states when all states involved are parties to the conflict. So, if State A is not a party to the conventions, but State B is, then neither State A or State B are bound by the terms of the convention. Now, this also used to be true for the Geneva Conventions before 1949. Both Germany and Japan used that as a reason for not applying the Geneva Conventions to Russian prisoners captured by Germany or to the treatment of any prisoner taken by the Japanese. Russia and Japan were not parties to the convention, so Japan didn't need to follow it, and Germany didn't have to follow it with regard to Russia. The trials in Nuremberg and Tokyo, however, saw things differently. The second problem is that the United States and Israel transgressed Syrian and Iraqi airspace in their attacks on Iran, which may appear to be a violation of the law of neutrality. However, none of these states, Israel, Syria, Iraq, or Iran, are signatories to the conventions that make up the law of neutrality, and therefore neither the United States nor Israel are bound to comply with the law of neutrality in their overflights. As I began, however, the law of neutrality does not replace peacetime international law, so there's that to consider. For a conflict where all states are parties to the law of neutrality, which include Ukraine and Russia, asserting the protections and authorities under that law can have an impact on the delivery of humanitarian aid and commerce in the Black Sea region. In the Persian Gulf, where Iran is not a party to those conventions, other neutral states could still assert their right to protect their flagged ships, using all means necessary for that protection, without compromising the neutral status of that state. All that requires to bring that to life are states with the resolve to assert these protections, with whatever military, diplomatic, or economic tools are necessary for the protection of their shipping. Unfortunately, that resolve seems to be lacking.